Hey everyone, my name is Rishi, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about pain signaling and the opioid crisis and how certain ways in which we're trying to combat that opioid crisis. So, just for some context, in 2016, about 42,000 people died from opioid overdoses in the US, which is the highest year on record, and it seems to continue to be growing. So, just a little bit of background on pain signaling and how that works. So essentially, if someone were to prick me on my hand right now, that signal would be transmitted by neurons up into my spinal cord and up to the brain for the conscious perception of pain. And one of the proteins that is heavily involved in this relay of pain signaling is called the NMDA receptor. So, as we can imagine, an increase in activity of the NMDA receptor is known to be associated with increased sensation of pain in the central nervous system. So, there's another protein involved in pain signaling called the mu opioid receptor. And when the mu opioid receptor is activated, it actually decreases the amount of signaling coming from the NMDA receptor, causing that conscious perception of pain. So, whether it be endogenous opioids like endorphins or exogenous opioids like morphine, when they bind to that mu opioid receptor, there's some communication allowing for that NMDA receptor to be decreased in signaling, and that communication actually also causes for a increased tolerance to opioids. So you may have heard of this in the past, but when people use more opioids, they need to use more and more to get the same effect, and that is due to the fact that there's some communication between the mu opioid receptor and the NMDA receptor in the spinal cord that causes a increased tolerance to pain initially, as well as that tolerance to the opioids itself. So, understanding that communication between the NMDA receptor and the mu opioid receptor would be kind of important in being able to combat the opioid epidemic or opioid crisis by allowing us to explore different pathways for different types of treatments for pain. So, without actually stimulating the mu opioid receptor, trying to uh, understand how we can decrease pain. So, some recent studies have actually established the role that the Hint1 protein plays in the communication between the mu opioid receptor and the NMDA receptor. So, this Hint1 protein is known to be involved in helping develop that tolerance to pain, so therefore decreasing the NMDA receptor signaling, as well as the ultimate increase in opioid tolerance. So naturally, some researchers were interested in understanding more about what would happen, say, if we inhibited the Hint1 protein. And they found that if you inhibit the Hint1 protein, there is a decrease in the response to opioids in the first place. So there's unfortunately no tolerance to pain, but then there's also the decrease in the development of tolerance to the opioids itself. So obviously the Hint1 inhibitor in and of itself as it is now would not be sufficient as a treatment because it decreases the effects of opioids in decreasing NMDA receptor activity. However, uh, there is something that knowing more about the Hint1 protein would be advantageous for us. And one of those reasons is by understanding neuropathic pain states. So, neuropathic pain is basically a situation where the disease itself is the pain. So there's a few different mechanisms by which this could happen and many more that we don't know. But essentially, different types of cells end up creating different types of proteins and expressing them at higher levels in pain states. And the certain proteins are involved in pathways that end up transmitting more pain to the central nervous system. So this Hint1 protein is likely involved in not just that communication between the mu opioid receptor and the NMDA receptor when exposed to opiates or endogenous opiates. It may actually be involved in the transmission of pain generally. So understanding the role of the Hint1 protein in neuropathic pain states rather than in neuropathic pain states with opioid exposure, we would be able to understand the basic role of the Hint1 protein under physiologic conditions, whether that be in neuropathic pain or in like a naive control state. So if we can understand the role of the Hint1 protein in neuropathic pain states rather than in the situation of opioid exposure with like acute pain or a pain that's only there for a certain amount of time, whereas the neuropathic pain is a prolonged pain. If we can understand the expression levels of the Hint1 protein in certain types of cell types, we would be able to elucidate more about the mechanism that Hint1 plays in transmitting pain to the nervous system, and ultimately, this Hint1 protein could be a target for future medicines.